Good evening. Welcome to the July 8th, 2015 meeting of the Murfreesboro Planning Commission. We have a quorum present as well as a full complement of staff. And so I'll call the meeting to order at this time. We have one item under old business today, and that is the Asbury Road and Florence Road right-of-way abandonment request for 2.4 acres of Asbury Road right-of-way and 0.21 acres of Florence Road right-of-way. Mr. Kevin Waldron is the applicant. Mr. Plummer.
Thank you, Chairman
Good
Lamb.
Evening, sir.
Good evening, Chairman Lamb and members of the Planning Commission. This item was, we had held a public hearing on it at the June 3rd Planning Commission meeting. At that time, the request was deferred until this meeting. Just to provide you a little bit of a reminder of the background on this item, this is excess right-of-way from the relocation of Asbury Road and the reconstruction of Florence Road. And I think I'm getting some feedback on my microphone. At any rate, this is excess right-of-way. Staff has studied the excess right-of-way and determined that we no longer need the right-of-way. The majority of the right-of-way is from the old Asbury Road. As you remember, we relocated Asbury Road with the Thistledown Section 4 subdivision to get it further away from the I-24 840 bridge. When this was deferred at the June 3rd meeting, after that, Mr. Sam Huddleston with the engineering department prepared a report for the Planning Commission. That report has been included in the agenda materials, and he made that presentation of his report at the June 17th meeting and answered questions at that time. Staff believes that the right-of-way abandonment is in good order. Typically, we make recommendations of specific conditions associated with a right-of-way abandonment. However, the typical conditions that we recommend the Planning Commission place on right-of-way abandonments are still kind of in flux at this time. We are still determining what will need to be done to actually transfer the property to the applicant. But with that being said, there is actually no need to have conditions on the Planning Commission's action. The conditions would be more appropriate the City Council's action. The Planning Commission is tasked with the decision of determining whether or not the right-of-way still serves a public purpose and needs to be retained as public right-of-way. And it's staff's contention that it no longer serves a public purpose and should not be retained as public right-of-way and should be transferred to the adjacent private property owner who has made the request for the right-of-way abandonment. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions. There's no need for another public hearing, as we already held a public hearing on this matter, and that's why we're bringing it up under old business. You'll also recall that Mr. Whitaker did meet with two of the speakers at the June 3rd public hearing, and if you would like to have him advise you remind you as to his meeting with those property owners, he'll be happy to do so. If the Planning Commission recommends approval on this right-of-way abandonment, then it will be forwarded to the City Council as a right-of-way abandonment / mandatory referral for the City Council's consideration. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Mr. Ives, everything okay on your side on this abandonment?
It is, yeah.
Okay. Any questions for staff? There's no questions. We're ready for a motion.
Make a motion we approve.
Second.
All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed. Motion carries. That concludes the old business portion of our agenda. Move on to public hearings. We have two public hearings scheduled this evening, the first of which is a rezoning application for approximately 2.9 acres located along North Thompson Lane and Medical Center Parkway to be rezoned from PUD to MU. Judy Beatty is the applicant. Ms. Green, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, sir. Our first public hearing this evening is to consider a rezoning request for property that's located on the northwestern corner of the intersection of Medical Center Parkway and North Thompson Lane. This property consists of 3 parcels. The area that's shaded orange, identified as area, is approximately 2.9 acres, and the people looking to purchase this property and develop it have requested a rezoning. The two parcels that are shaded blue are identified as additional study area, and those were included as additional study area by the Planning Commission to study whether or not you would like to include it in the rezoning efforts or to remove it. And so as a total, the property equals 5.9 acres, including the 1.4 additional commercial center, the 1.6 acre Walgreens, and then the requested area. This property is currently zoned PUD as Planned Unit District, and it's adjacent to property zoned MU, Mixed Use District. The MU district is to the west. To the south, to the east, and to the north, the properties are zoned Light Industrial District. All of these properties are located within the city's Gateway Design Overlay District, and this request would not change this property being located in the GDO. The request is to change the zoning from PUD to MU, Mixed Use District. This property was rezoned to PUD in 2008, and there was a specific plan at that time. And I've included it as an attachment in your agenda packets the Plan Development Program book that was provided to you or to the Planning Commission City Council for that 2008. And I'll just go through the plan development. You can see that Lot 1 is identified as 1.52 acres, and it's retail, and it was at that time expected to become a Walgreens and is currently a Walgreens. And then Lot 2 is the remaining property, includes the retail area, which is also currently developed, and there's a firehouse sub in that retail area and some other commercial uses. And then to the rear, which is actually to the north, is the remaining part of Lot 2, which was proposed to be a 3-story office residential condo. And I think that is the primary purpose for this property being requested to be zoned PUD. A PUD allows the mix of residential and commercial uses. We did not have a zoning district at the time that would permit that. They had a very specific plan and wanted to move forward with this as a unified development. And since that time, that it's changed. The Walgreens, of course, was constructed and sold almost immediately. The retail center construction began, but it wasn't finished. And you may recall that for some amount of time it remained unfinished until a separate property owner came in and finished it out. And then the area to the back has remained undeveloped. We have been approached by the owners of Marty and Liz, who are looking at that back portion of Lot 2, would like to develop a commercial center there, are not interested at all in doing a 3-story office residential condo. There's no residential portion to their request, so they'd like to rezone the property. Staff suggested that because it is adjacent to mixed-use district, MU, that would be an appropriate district, and of course for it to remain in the Gateway Design Overlay District. The current PUD identifies Lot 2 to allow the 3-story office residential condo with a maximum of 45,000 square feet, and some of the uses that are currently allowed are banks, beauty shop, clothing store, restaurants, retail shops, personal service establishments, office, and residential. The mixed-use district would continue to allow those things. So there's, from my research, nothing that is currently allowed that would not be allowed in the future. The other two parcels, it was staff's recommendation that you study those for rezoning. We didn't have a request for them, but I was able to contact the owner of the retail center, and they were in favor of the zoning change and thought that it really had no impact on them at all. And the Walgreens, with the way their corporate model is set up, it's very difficult to get a hold of anybody. But we did send them a letter and let them know about this change, and I haven't heard from them. But again, I did hear from the retail owners, and they didn't have any concerns with this. It was my understanding from the last meeting that I had to leave. Mr. Blomley covered for me that you had questions about those nonconformities that might be created with this rezoning request. So the lots that currently exist and are proposed would conform to the mixed-use district. The uses would conform to the mixed-use district. The plan development did identify some exceptions, and I've got a page, it's identified as page 12 in your book, or you can look on the screen if you're able to read that, and it tells those exceptions from the regular standards that were requested. One is that a minimum separation between the parking and access area that we require in the GDO be lessened, and I'll go in detail on that in just a minute. The second was they wanted an exception for the maximum height, which was 35 feet, and the third is a lesser landscape buffer along the adjacent property line. Now, the second and third exceptions really aren't necessary anymore. The maximum building height in the mixed-use district would, of course, permit what was proposed, and so that is not anything that they would need any longer. Of course, they're not looking to do a 3-story building at this time. And then the lesser landscape buffer along the adjacent property lines wouldn't be required because the adjacent property has been rezoned to mixed-use district, so there's no buffer required between the two properties. The reason a lesser buffer was considered was because it's always been anticipated that the adjacent properties would develop with a commercial-type use, although the zoning hadn't caught up yet. The zoning now wouldn't require that. And it may be a little difficult for you to see, but the areas where there is a property line, the gateway standards require a separation of 10 to 15 feet, depending on the size of the parcel, on each side of the parcel. So it would be a total of 20 or 30 feet with landscaping there. Because they're sharing an access drive, they thought that it would be a bit much to have 20 to 30 feet of landscaping there simply because of the parcel line. So the exception that would become a lawfully established nonconforming use, if you do rezone the property, would be that separation requirement and the required landscaping in that separation, which is located along the shared access aisle here and to the back. So where those number ones are. And I don't, of course, you can tell me what you think, but I don't think that the site's looked at negatively with those exceptions that have been approved and it's been constructed that way. Mr. Matt Taylor is here, and I'm going to invite him to the lectern to provide some additional information regarding this rezoning request. You, of course, can choose to rezone only the requested area. You may choose to rezone the entire area, or you may choose to rezone none of the property. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them before or after the public hearing, and at this time, I'll invite Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Ms. Green. I'm Matt Taylor of SEC here in town. I don't have a formal presentation. I think Ms. Green went over our user. I think we answered several questions at the workshop, but myself as well as the applicant and Mr. Harney are here if you do have any specific questions of us.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Taylor. Any questions of staff before we open the public hearing? Okay, I'll open the public hearing, ask anybody to come forward that'd like to speak. If you would, keep your comments to no more than 3 to 5 minutes, and make all your questions to the Planning Commission, the staff. We'll make notes of them if you have any questions, and try to get them answered at the conclusion of the public hearing. That being said, I'll open the public hearing at this time, ask anybody to come forward that'd like to speak. Nobody? In that case, I'll close the public hearing. Any questions for members of the staff or the applicant? If not, we're ready for a motion.
I think my wife would not let me come home if I voted against a shoe store coming to Murfreesboro, so I'm going to go ahead and make the motion for approval
Would that be for the entire area?
for the entire MU usage, yes.
Second the motion.
Motion's made and seconded. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Second public hearing is Florence Road right-of-way abandonment request for 0.1 acres of Florence Road right-of-way. Mr. Gary Houck, Mr. Chad Shahari are the applicants. Mr. Plumley.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb. Our second public hearing tonight is with regards to the abandonment of another portion of the old Florence Road right-of-way. This is actually the portion of the old Florence Road right-of-way that is directly adjacent to Northwest Broad Street. You can see it on the map in front of you. It's the area colored in orange. It is the area in between the railroad tracks and the Northwest Broad Street right-of-way. Up until around the early 2000s, many of you may remember, Florence Road actually intersected with Northwest Broad Street at about a 45-degree angle. Then in the early 2000s, it was reconstructed and shifted further to the northwest so that it intersected with Northwest Broad Street at a 90-degree angle. So there is a remnant piece of the Florence Road right-of-way that is 0.12 acres that is located in between the Florence Station Market at 5409 Northwest Broad Street and City Limits Liquor at 5353 Northwest Broad Street. City Limits Liquor is owned by Mr. Houck, and Florence Station Market is owned by Mr. Chowdhury, and they have filed this request jointly through their engineer, Mr. Bill Huddleston. Included in the agenda materials is a right-of-way abandonment study completed by the planning staff. There are a number of utility and drainage easements that have been identified that will need to be retained over the existing right-of-way if it is to be abandoned and transferred to become private property. The applicants have also submitted an exhibit that shows how they have proposed to divide the right-of-way, which is right down the center line of the old Florence Road right-of-way. Both of the properties are already kind of at a skewed angle as they abut the existing Florence Road right-of-way, and dividing it down the center line of the road would keep the new property line at a very skewed angle, and staff believes would make the redevelopment of the properties or additions, whether they be building additions, parking lot additions, would make them more difficult. Staff believes that the property line should be squared up to the extent possible, and we would encourage the applicants to work together to revise the exhibit prior to the transfer of the property so that it is squared up better to promote better development and or redevelopment of the parcels in the future. If the Planning Commission approves this right-of-way abandonment request, staff recommends the following conditions of approval. Utility and drainage easements as needed must be retained prior to the abandonment of the right-of-way. The applicants must provide a legal description, an exhibit, and any other documentation necessary for the preparation of the required legal documents, and all legal documents are subject to the approval of the city attorney. The Planning Commission will need to conduct a public hearing, after which it will need to discuss the matter and decide whether or not to formulate a recommendation of approval to the City Council. The Planning Commission's action will be forwarded on to the City Council for action. With that being said, the planning staff, in its consultation with the various other departments, has determined that this right-of-way really does not serve a public purpose any longer. For all intents and purposes, it serves as a private drive to enter both of the adjoining properties, and staff recommends its abandonment subject to the conditions listed. I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing.
Any questions for the staff? Thank you, Mr. Plumley. There's no questions. I'll open the public hearing. Ask anybody to come forward that'd like to speak. Seeing no one come forward, I'll close the public hearing. Any questions or comments by the Planning Commission? If there are none, we're ready for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move for approval subject to all staff comments.
Second.
All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. That completes the public hearing portion of our agenda. Move on to staff reports and other business. Mr. Whitaker.
Chairman, it is that time of year when we need to elect a new chair and vice chair for the Planning Commission. So I guess I task the chair with helping us out.
Yeah. Discussion, argument, and motions, whatever.
I think we like the ones we have, so I would make a motion that we, or I would nominate Mr. Bob Lamb for chair and Mr. Doug Young for vice chair.
Second motion.
Motion's made. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? I abstain.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Show me the money. Mr. Whitaker, you have anything else?
I
Staff
think
reports?
that's all. Staff?
Thanks, staff. Well, amazing with as much business going on in Murfreesboro right now, we had this short of an agenda, but
Don't worry,
next 2 weeks from now, we'll have a big one, I'm sure. But I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. At this time, we'll call this meeting adjourned.